So this is Hebrews chapter 7, the scripture for the 21st of October. Now in this chapter, the author of the book of Hebrews fleshes out a priesthood, a theology priesthood, that's anchored in the story of Melchizedek. You can find this story in Genesis chapter 14, specifically verses 17 through 20, although the rest of Genesis 14 offers some perhaps helpful context to the story. We've heard the name Melchizedek once before in the book of Hebrews. I believe we heard it back in chapter 5 when the psalm was first quoted. That is quoted a couple more times, Psalm 110 here. So this mysterious figure of Melchizedek, he comes on the scene real briefly in Genesis 14. Really, these verses are the only place that Melchizedek appears in Scripture, and every other mention of his name in Scripture is referring back to Genesis 14. There's a bevy of symbolism, I think, that's associated with Melchizedek. And if you read through those few verses in Genesis 14, you'll see immediately Melchizedek brings bread and wine and partakes of it with Abraham. I mean, this is an early primitive version of communion to some degree. This prefigures the communion ritual, and then at the same time, the author of Hebrews notes, not only does the literal translation from the Hebrew of Melchizedek give king of righteousness, but also this Melchizedek is the king of Salem. Salem is a primitive version of the city Jerusalem. And Salem is related to the word salam, which in Arabic is peace, and the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace or human flourishing. And so the author of Hebrews connects Melchizedek, king of righteousness, who happens to be the king of Salem, king of peace. He connects these things together. So this is the only instance of a royal priest in Scripture, besides God's promises to turn Israel into a royal priesthood, besides Jesus Christ, who serves God as a royal priest. And Melchizedek's God is God Most High, the one who made heaven and earth. And so even though this Melchizedek was not a descendant of Abraham, was not an Israelite by any means, this Melchizedek gets it. He bears a strong resemblance in many ways to Jesus Christ. And I think this is effectively the point the author of Hebrews is making. Not only is Jesus' priesthood similar to that of Melchizedek, but this priesthood is greater than the Aaronic or the Levitical priesthood. While all of Israel paid the tithe, the 10% to the Levites, Abraham paid 10% of his spoils to Melchizedek himself. And so the author of the book of Hebrews is basically arguing, look, even though all of Israel pays the tithe, the tithe itself was paid from Levi, who was still in Abraham's loins, to Melchizedek. And you don't pay someone who's inferior to you. You don't pay them sort of a patronage. You only pay someone who's superior to you. And so in that way, the Melchizedek priesthood is a greater order of priesthood than the Levitical or Aaronic priesthood. While each of the priests offered sacrifices daily, both for themselves and for others, Jesus, as a priest in the order of Melchizedek, offered a sacrifice once for all time. While each Aaronic priest needed to be replaced as they were mortal, Jesus continues forever, and so stands as our priest for all time. And so the author of the book of Hebrews is really harping on this point, that the order of Melchizedek is greater than the order of Aaron. Now remember, some of the hearers and readers of this of this sermon, this letter, were intrigued by the practices of Judaism, potentially willing to leave the way, as the early church was called, and join Judaism. But the priesthood that still held sway in Judaism is the Aaronic priesthood. This was shown to be obsolete by the person and work of Jesus Christ, and to leave Christianity, which worships God through the eternal royal priesthood of Jesus Christ alone, in favor of Judaism, which worships God through the Aaronic priesthood, that's leaving a permanent eternal thing for a provisional and temporary thing, according to the prophecy in Psalm 110, where God names an eternal priest in the order of Melchizedek. That just generally seems like the wrong direction to go, right? It seems like a bad decision to abandon Christianity for Judaism here. By establishing the superiority of Jesus to past priests, the author is also setting up the argument for the next several chapters that the old law is a shadow of the new. So in light of that, I wonder, how do you see Jesus as your high priest? That's all for Hebrews chapter 7. Tomorrow, the 22nd of October, we'll look at Hebrews chapter 8. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.